Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Public Utilities Commission Broadband Caseworker Seminar Series. This is Broadband Business 101. My name is Karen Eckersley.
And my name is Caleb Jones. The Broadband Caseworkers have created a series of webinars covering the business, technology, and policy context that communities will need to provide broadband. The yellow highlighted area shows which webinar this is, and the rest of the slide provides an overview of the webinar series. This is the first of the 3 webinars on the business of broadband. This 3-part series is designed to help communities understand the broadband market, how they might engage the broadband market, and what factors will determine the costs, revenues, and subscribers for broadband in their community.
This slide shows the agenda. The first part of this series is about the market itself. We'll be talking about the structure of the market, both in the last mile and the middle mile. How do they fit together? How should communities understand last mile and middle mile projects, both as consumers and potentially as service providers? This session will also introduce public-private partnerships and how communities can maximize the public's interest in a new service provider. We'll expand on this topic in the second-level webinars. This session will also introduce business planning and concepts such as revenues, costs, and take rates. At the end of each section, we will pause for discussion questions.
Our goal for this section on the last and middle mile markets is for participants to understand the service providers, the customers, the products and services being sold, and how this all fits together with a particular focus on the last mile. The infrastructure of the internet within the United States is generally divided into 3 categories: long haul, middle mile, and last mile. The services, the providers, and the markets all basically follow the design of the infrastructure. There is a long-haul market provided over long-haul fiber. There is a middle-mile market provided over middle-mile fiber. Then, most consequentially, for communities considering how to meet their residents' needs, there is the last-mile market, which provides access to the public internet to individual households and businesses. The next level up from there is the middle mile, which is both physically and economically the bridge between the backbone of the internet and the local networks that connect our homes and businesses. The middle mile typically refers to the services that are sold wholesale to last mile providers who then distribute those services to their customers. Occasionally, you may hear people use the term middle mile to refer to services that are sold directly by middle mile providers to large anchor institutions, such as governments, hospitals, universities, tech companies, etc. But it mostly refers to last mile traffic that has been collected and bundled together to be transported more efficiently to the next city. For a community-based broadband provider, it may help to think of last mile services as what you are selling and middle mile services as what you're buying. In your community, there will be an interconnection point, either in town or nearby, where you will be able to buy services from an entity that will connect you back to the nearest major data center. This will likely be San Francisco, San Diego, or Los Angeles, or potentially Phoenix, Seattle, or Portland. That middle mile connection is the intermediate bridge between your local network and the backbone of the internet.
This slide shows the last mile services that a local service provider will sell. The most important service for an unserved community is called consumer grade services. Consumer grade services are the lowest price tier of services and what many of us buy at our homes. Some consumer grade services are fast and others are slow, but what defines them as a consumer grade is that the speeds and service quality are not guaranteed. The company will make their best effort to restore service during outages and provide the speeds they advertise, but they are selling the maximum speeds, not the minimums. Consumer-grade services typically range in price from $30 to $60 a month at the lower end and up to $100 to $300 for small businesses and sometimes in rural areas. The next step up is called business class services. This is typically what a small or medium-sized business might buy if they need reliability and more capacity than a typical consumer. If there's too much traffic on the network for everyone to get the speeds that they're paying for, purchasers of business class services may have their traffic prioritized over regular consumers. Increasingly, households that work from home during the day are paying for business class services, but primarily these services are purchased by small and medium businesses. The third category of last mile services are known as enterprise level services. Enterprise level services are sold to more sophisticated businesses or institutions that need guarantees of a certain quality of services, such as hospitals, universities, or major banks. If the service provider fails to meet the quality of service guarantees, the service provider may pay penalties as defined in their contract with the enterprise. Enterprise-level services are almost always custom priced, based on the amount of capacity the customer needs, how many facilities they are connecting, the quality of service guarantees they need, and a range of other factors. We can usually expect the price of these services to start in the thousands of dollars per month and go up from there. Most small service providers, particularly community service providers at the local level, will be focused on consumer-grade services and business class services.
Thank you for explaining last mile services. Next, we're going to discuss the middle mile. The middle mile bridges the local network and the internet backbone. If you didn't buy middle mile services, you'd basically be an island with fabulously fast communication within the community, but disconnected from the wider internet. These middle mile services can be broken down into two categories: transport and commodity internet bandwidth. Basically, transport is the road that connects your network to the internet backbone. It is the service that connects those two places. Commodity bandwidth is the goods being transported. It's the number of gigabits or terabits of data that you need. The transport is the cost of bringing that internet data from the backbone to your local network. So, for example, let's imagine a consumer is trying to watch a movie on the internet. The service provider will pay for both the internet bandwidth and the cost of transporting it along the middle mile network from the data center it's stored in to the household watching it. For most community service providers, the difference between bandwidth and transport is not very important because they will be buying both of them locally from the same middle mile service provider. However, for some service providers, it may be helpful to understand the different prices for bandwidth in different markets and the different prices for transport services between them. For instance, bandwidth tends to be very cheap in major data hubs with a lot of competition, like San Francisco, but buying bandwidth in a rural area will tend to be more expensive because the community is likely paying for transport from somewhere like San Francisco anyway. Bringing down the price of these transport services is the reason that California is building the state-owned open access middle mile network, which may well be how you will access middle mile services in your community. When you are exploring your middle mile options, you may also hear the term dark fiber, so I want to be sure we all know what that refers to. Dark fiber is fiber that has been installed already, but is not currently being used. One option for some service providers dealing with high transport costs will be to purchase access to dark fiber in their area and light it by installing electronics at both ends to provide their own transport service. This is a complicated solution, and it's only an option if there is dark fiber already deployed in your region, but it is worth considering.
We're going to pause here for a moment. Who are the service providers in your area for these services? Long haul, middle mile, last mile? Who provides consumer-grade services, business-grade services, and enterprise-level services? What do the pricing components of transport, commodity internet bandwidth mean for a contract? Does your jurisdiction own or control any infrastructure that is used for the provision of internet service? Follow-up questions can always be sent to us. Now, who are the companies that provide last mile services? In wireline, the major categories are the telephone companies, cable companies, and the competitors. In wireless, the major categories are mobile companies, fixed wireless companies, and mobile fixed hybrids. It's easy to confuse mobile and fixed wireless companies, but they have differing capabilities. Mobile cellular companies are probably the ones we're most familiar with: T-Mobile, AT&T Mobility, and Verizon. Fixed wireless companies offer a wireless service, but they offer it to a fixed point, like your home or office, not to a handheld or mobile device. There is a category for mobile fixed service, which refers to the service that in rural areas, some cellular companies are using their mobile networks to offer fixed service, a service in your home through a hotspot. It's only available in some select areas, but if the right infrastructure happens to be available in your area, it's possible that one of these companies will offer to sell you this service.
The first category of wireline companies are the incumbents, which are the phone companies that used to be part of AT&T starting over 100 years ago and are sometimes called ILECs, or incumbent local exchange carriers. The second category is cable companies, who have been around for about 40 years. Then there are competitors who have entered the market in recent years seeking to provide competition to those entities. What you see in this graphic is an overview of the three kinds of companies, the services they offer, and the capabilities of those services. At the left end of the speed scale is 54 kilobits per second, which is the speed of dial-up internet. At the right end is 1 gigabit per second, which is only really possible with fiber or a combination of cable and fiber. This graphic shows different speeds and capabilities because it's important to understand that different companies sell different kinds of internet service. It's the same internet, of course, but they'll have different speeds, reliabilities, and capacities. That's not necessarily because of business decisions they're making, but because of the capabilities of their networks and the limitations of their networks, which depend on the technologies that they use. The first category is the incumbent, which in California will mostly consist of AT&T, Frontier, Consolidated Communications, and a number of smaller companies. Those first three are by far the biggest, and AT&T is the biggest of them all. In most markets, there will only be one incumbent phone network because these companies have tended not to compete with one another for the same territory. The products the incumbents offer will vary from location to location. Very few places have only dial-up today, but plenty of places use DSL, which is an electronically upgraded version of the same copper wire network as dial-up. This technology tends to max out in the single-digit megabits per second. In some select areas, the incumbents have deployed fiber, which is able to offer considerably faster, symmetrical speeds, ranging from 100 megabits to a gigabit per second or more. The next category is the cable companies that built video networks in the 70s and 80s, and then deployed technologies that allowed them to use the same network to provide cable internet service. Because they had faster cables than the thin copper wires that the telephone companies had, they were able to provide faster internet than DSL could, but not quite as fast as a pure fiber to the premises connection. However, these companies only deployed in population centers and are generally not available in more rural areas. Finally, there are the competitors. These companies don't have established territory like the incumbents do, and are only deploying in certain areas. Typically, they are building fiber to the premises in select markets, frequently urban and high-income areas, where they are competing against the incumbents and differentiating themselves via faster or more reliable infrastructure. We'll talk more about how companies have differentiated themselves in part 3 of this series. The evolution of these companies is closely tied to the evolution of the broadband technologies they use. You can see that with the development of cable and fiber. We also see a wave of new companies challenging the incumbents with the new technology. So dial-up gets upgraded to DSL, but still uses the same copper wire network. so it doesn't spawn many new companies. Cable is an order of magnitude faster and creates new networks and new companies in the 80s. Then, starting in the 2000s, fiber starts to be deployed by both incumbents and new companies, providing state-of-the-art speeds that will meet households' needs for decades to come.
Now, let's talk about the last mile wireless market. This is important not only for understanding what's happening in the market generally, but also because many community networks will find that they are competing to some extent with a last mile wireless provider. There are a lot of really important uses for broadband: job searches, working from home, distributed learning, homework, home-based businesses, and telehealth. And all these need the reliability, speeds, and capacity of a fixed connection. If you're trying to do a lot or have a lot of people in your home, mobile wireless usually cannot deliver consistently. A community broadband provider may find that they are competing with a mobile provider for some customers, perhaps because some low-income households cannot afford both, or because mobile had previously been the only option available. Next on this slide, you see fixed wireless, which is considered broadband by policymakers. They offer a wide range of speeds depending on the spectrum being used and the terrain that it's being used in. This is a fixed connection, but even in the areas where fixed wireless is available, its availability will vary from home to home, depending on many factors. Sometimes the service will depend on whether the provider has a good line of sight to the household, and these connections can become unreliable in different weather conditions. Cellular companies are increasingly offering fixed wireless service on top of their mobile networks where they have the infrastructure for it. We're mentioning it here because it will be important for community networks to understand what they may end up competing with.
Okay, let's pause again here for some discussion. Who are the last mile providers in your community? What technologies do they use? And what services do they provide?
This next slide shows the California Interactive Broadband Map. You can find it at broadbandmap.ca.gov. This is a great location to see which companies are serving in your community and what their advertised speeds are. If you click on ISP search and put a pin in an area, you can see the ISPs serving there. This example shows Corning, California, where you can see 2 fixed ISPs with service. There is also a tab for mobile services. In Corning, Calaveras offers DSL of up to 10 megabits per second down and 1 megabit per second up. And Cal.net is offering fixed wireless of up to 25 down and 5 up. This next screen shows Compton, California, where the blue dot is on the map. In Compton, you can see on the right, the companies are Charter, which does business as Spectrum, and AT&T. Charter is a cable company offering for sale up to 940 megabit download speeds and 35 megabit per second upload speeds. AT&T is offering up to 18 down and 2 up, or 100 down and 20 up. You can also use the address search function and see coverage with different layers.
We're going to pause again for questions and to give you a chance to try using the California Interactive Broadband Map for yourselves. Please enter your favorite address in the search bar on the left-hand side of the map. See the tabs on the left for the ISP offering service. And do you know if there are companies or services missing from the map in your community?
In this next section, we will look at how all of the factors we've discussed come together: the providers, the customers, and the services they buy and sell. The goal is to understand where a community network would fit into this market. What do you need to buy? From whom? What do you need to sell? To whom?
This chart shows middle mile services and last mile services on the left, as well as the customers that buy those services. Along the top, the chart shows the service providers for those services. At the high end is enterprise services, which sort of skirt the line between last mile and middle mile. Then we have the more common services, business class and consumer grade services. For service providers, starting at the far right, we have community providers. These are the kinds of entities that offer community-focused solutions at the local level. Many of the folks applying to the CPUC for funding opportunities will be community providers dedicated to providing networks to serve their local market. If you look down the graphic, you'll see that they're expected to mostly serve consumer-grade services. Generally, these are the services that it is realistic for community providers to offer, as well as the services that community providers are most interested in offering, so there's a real alignment of capabilities and mission. Now, let's discuss the other kinds of providers in the market and the services they provide. Typically, the largest incumbents and competitors use their networks to serve all of these segments of the market. They'll sell middle mile services to other ISPs, they'll sell wireless backhaul to mobile wireless companies or to fixed wireless companies, and they sell the full range of last mile services to consumers, businesses, and enterprise. We will talk more about the opportunities for partnering with incumbents or competitors for some of these more sophisticated services at the top of the graphic when we get to models of public-private partnerships. Finally, there are infrastructure companies and enterprise service providers. These are companies that do not sell directly to consumers or small businesses. From right to left, enterprise service providers are companies that connect major institutions, data centers, major businesses, etc., and sometimes sell usage of their network to ISPs, but they do not sell to residential customers or small businesses. Infrastructure companies are similar, but don't even sell to enterprises. They only sell transport and bandwidth to internet service providers. Hopefully that gives you a better understanding of who the major players in the broadband market are, what they do, and how you might need to interact with them.
Let's pause here again to discuss any questions that you have about the full market. Who are the incumbents and or cable providers in your area? What role do you imagine your community playing in this market? What services will you be buying? From whom? What services will you be selling? From whom? You can always follow up with questions to us at statewidebroadband.cpuc.ca.gov.
The next section provides an overview of public-private partnerships. We'll go into more detail on these in the next seminar, but we want to introduce these ideas now to spark some thinking as early as possible about the range of options that you have.
The next few slides show different ways of thinking about the range of options for how involved a public sector entity wants to be in providing broadband service. This slide shows 3 options on the left-hand side, which I will describe. The first is the traditional model. Some communities build their own vertically integrated municipal broadband companies. This is where the public sector builds the network, owns it, and operates it. This model can provide fast, affordable, reliable networks. The challenge is that it's frequently a new operation, and it's a lot of work to build a new functionality. To share risk, we've seen public-private partnerships in which some functions are shared between the public and the private sectors. Now to the middle of this slide. One popular model is called public ownership private operations, in which the public entity builds and owns the underlying fiber asset, but then partners with a private company to operate that infrastructure, conducting marketing and sales, providing customer service and repairs, and collecting payments. Some benefits of the community ownership model is that the community has an opportunity during contracting to negotiate for public benefits, such as certain service levels or providing free services to some institutions, or whatever the community and the service provider can agree to. But a community leasing out its infrastructure has less control over how service providers than in a fully municipal broadband net model. We'll talk more about how these trade-offs and other models of public-private partnerships operate in the next seminar series. At the other end of the spectrum, at the bottom of this slide, there's a minimal role for local public entity. This is sometimes called the public facilitation of private effort. This means that the public does not take a direct stake in constructing, owning, or operating the infrastructure or providing services, but does ensure that the internet service provider has easy access to public rights-of-way and any other public assets and necessary permits. This is mostly what communities have now, so you can decide if you like this model or not. In the next seminar sessions, we'll have an overview of business planning. We'll discuss the various factors that determine costs and revenues, such as take rates and revenues per user, and how these vary in the different kinds of markets.
This slide gives you a more visual summary of what Karen just said. From left to right, we have the most hands-off facilitation model in which the government's role is limited to assisting with rights of way and permitting. In the public infrastructure private operations model, the government also builds and owns the infrastructure, but leases it out to service providers. In the community ownership and operations model, the government manages the network and serves its residents itself.
This is another way of visualizing the same framework, which we'll go into more detail in a future seminar. What we're showing on this slide are the responsibilities on the left-hand side: real estate, fiber infrastructure, network equipment, operations, and service provision. Along the top are the three models we have been discussing. The gray shaded areas are which entity is responsible for which area of operation. In the first one, where the public entity is facilitating the private entity, the public entity will be responsible for permitting and rights of way. As you move to the right, the public entity has increasing responsibility for the operations of the network. As you can see, for example, service provision. In the middle, there's a different mix of responsibilities. And here's where it's important to know what you're contracting for and how to get the service level agreements to where you want them to be.
Let's pause one more time for some discussion questions. Do you already have a sense for what your community's relationship with the private sector will be for broadband infrastructure? What challenges are you considering? Does your entity have prior experience operating public-private partnerships? What lessons have you learned? What questions would you like answered when we dive deeper into public-private partnerships in the next seminar?
Our last topic today is an introduction to the business of broadband planning. We will be focusing on this topic in much greater detail later in this seminar series. Here, we will be looking at some key metrics for the network in your community, such as take rate, which is the percentage of households that choose to subscribe, customer churn, the tendency of customers with options to bounce between service providers, and revenue and cost. Everyone is interested in these two factors.
Here are some of the factors to consider when estimating what the take rate in your community will be. The first factor to consider is what kinds of internet access are already available in your community. For example, if downtown has cable internet, but the rest of the community has nothing, then you will have very different take rates in the areas that do and do not have a competing network. Statistically, age, income, and education are demographics that influence take rate more. We'll discuss state and federal affordability programs and digital literacy programs that can help boost take rates among populations that might be less likely to sign up otherwise. Finally, we'll discuss some of the advantages that community networks have over their competition that can help your take rate.
This slide lists some additional factors to consider when estimating your community's take rate. First is the take rate ramp. This is the rate of subscription which increases over time. It's reasonable to expect that you'll sign up roughly a quarter of your eventual market each year after launching. If you're a new provider with a great price and symmetrical service, these numbers are going to go way up. The elements which impact this are the number and identity of competitors, the demographics of your service area, and the execution factors. Notably among the execution factors is customer service. If you're using one of your existing businesses to provide customer service, you're already better off. They're local, and the people who are answering the phone are you. Some of the other factors in determining the take-up rate ramp are listed here. That is, the speed of network activation and drop installation. These factors may lag construction and require a different capacity and logistics for operations. The second bullet here, incumbent tools, which are lock-ins and promotions. Is your target market stuck in a 2-year contract? You may consider buying them out of it. Finally, word of mouth is going to do a lot of work for you. These factors about take rate are things that make a public entity and should be things that you think about to decide and understand.
That's the end of the new material that we were planning to present to you today, but we wanted to give you one more chance to discuss what we've presented so far. What take rate would you expect for a new fiber provider in your community? What questions would you like answered when we dive deeper into these topics in the next seminar? And do you already have a sense for what your community's broadband business plan will look like? What challenges are you concerned about, and what unique opportunities are available in your community?
Thank you for joining us for the CPUC's Business of Broadband webinar. This slide shows some of the topics that you can look forward to in future business webinars covering public-private partnerships and business planning. If there are topics you would like us to cover in future webinars, or if you would like to speak with us about scheduling an in-person seminar on these topics for your community or government, please contact us at broadbandcaseworkers@cpuc.ca.gov.